And Senator Tom Cotton, both on the line with me to talk about their new legislation that would allow Americans to sue China for coronavirus damages. I'm very excited about this to get both of their thoughts on why this is the best approach and if they can pull it off. But first, gentlemen, there was two huge breaking news items overnight, and I would be derelict in my responsibilities as a journalist to not get your takes on both of these. The first one being Kim Jong-un, the reports thus far unconfirmed that he had suffered some sort of perhaps brain damage, who knows, something grave in a surgery that took place. We know he's very overweight. There's fears that maybe he was going to be susceptible to the coronavirus. We know so little coming out of North Korea, but any thoughts? Senator Cotton, you first.
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me on. It's good to be on with Dan. I've seen the conflicting news reports from CNN and from South Korean news sources, so I don't want to speculate about what the facts may be. As you say, Alex, Kim Jong-un is not exactly a picture of physical fitness and good health. But until we have confirmation, I don't want to speculate about what his condition may be.
Sure. I'm guessing, Congressman, you'll have a similar response?
It's similar to Senator Cotton, yes. We don't know enough right now to be analyzing it, frankly.
Yeah, fair enough. Also breaking news last night, the president suggested that he's getting ready an executive order to shut down all immigration into the United States. Any thoughts on this move? What could be behind the timing? Again, Senator, let's start with you.
Alex, I believe the timing is in part driven by the needs just to get all the policy details lined out. Immigration largely come to a halt over the last month in any event, and this formalizes what had become or what had been essentially kind of organic agency practice at the direction of the president and his senior aides. I think it only makes sense at a time when we have a deadly pandemic circling the world that we tighten the controls at our border. And then inside the country, of course, when we have a terrible tragedy, 22 million people have lost their jobs, and regrettably more probably will in the weeks ahead, that we focus on getting Americans back to work in those jobs before we start importing more foreign workers to compete for those jobs.
Congressman, any thoughts?
Yeah, similarly, I think there's a public health argument for it. There's an economic argument for it. I tell you what's going to interest me is, if you've noticed the last couple of weeks, the left wing has criticized Trump for not doing enough of a travel ban on the Chinese travel restrictions back in January. He was widely criticized for that. So I wonder how they're going to about face and now completely criticize this particular travel ban.
So, Congressman, you found yourself in an interesting position over the weekend where you were on Bill Maher's program, and he did not have the benefit of his audience with him at his side. I've been on the show, and it's very fun to debate him when the crowd is so stacked against you. And you did a great job, went very viral, basically trying to lay out some of the facts. And the left does seem to be obsessed with blaming Trump for all of this and not China. It does seem like there's 100 times as much focus on the president's role and compared to China's.
Yeah, and they beclown themselves in the process because it's very difficult to argue something when the evidence is stacked against you. They've got a lot of confidence in arguing that because they generally get a lot of cover from mainstream media. They will repeat a mantra, something like the lost month of February. And they'll never back it up. They'll never really say why they believe it's the lost month of February. They'll never make an argument, but they'll repeat it over and over again. You notice this. It gets repeated throughout the media. It gets repeated by every single Democrat. It's like a collective. They're very good at this kind of messaging. And then they just scoff at you if you question it in this sort of smug kind of way. And if we're willing to break past that and kind of go behind enemy lines and actually have the debate, it can really go in our favor.
Yeah, it's a great lesson. And as Senator, we share a little bit of history in all of this, I think, when people look back on this, which is that you called in an exclusive to Breitbart way back on January 22nd, urging the president to consider a ban on travel from China over the coronavirus. So you're as much of an authority on this as any American. What's your evaluation of the way the president has handled this crisis?
Well, I think the president was early in January to recognize the risk. That's why he, in fact, impose those travel restrictions, something that Joe Biden called xenophobic and hysterical, and that the China apologists at the WHO condemned and tried to prevent and discourage other countries from doing. We now know, as Dan said, that bought us a lot of time. Obviously, there were some missteps in the bureaucracy at the CDC and the FDA, but we also have to recognize this is a global pandemic, and every country is struggling to handle this pandemic. Some have done better than others, and the United States is one of those that has done a pretty good job. Have we gotten everything right? No, of course not. But if you compare to other countries that are similar situated around the world, we've done a pretty good job of protecting our people, especially protecting our healthcare system, so it's not overwhelmed in the way you saw first in Wuhan and then in Italy and Spain. And that's one reason why the president and his team last week were able to issue guidelines that will help people get back to work, get back to something like normal routines, and start getting the economy back on its feet in the days and the weeks ahead. If we had faced a situation like they faced in places where the healthcare system had collapsed, then we wouldn't be there. And as the president himself said yesterday, we lost 40,000 people tragically with our guard up. Just imagine what would have happened if we had had our guard down, if the president hadn't stopped travel early from China, hadn't stopped travel early from Europe, hadn't called for 15 days to slow the spread in the middle of March, and then called for 30 days in April, how much worse it could have been.
Sure, especially considering if you'd listened to the establishment press, then of course we would have all done nothing because we all would have been afraid of being called racist. So that's always the challenge that falls on the president. So again, my guests right now, Congressman Dan Crenshaw and Senator Tom Cotton, who are leading the way on trying to hold China accountable for this virus, its spread, and the misinformation that's led to not just global pandemic, but economic crisis. Gentlemen, let's talk about what you put on the table. Whoever would like to begin, the floor is yours.
Senator Cotton, leading in the Senate, so I'll go ahead, sir.
Alex, so we've introduced legislation that would amend something called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which regulates the traditional doctrine of sovereign immunity among nations and their leaders. It's not an ironclad rule, and it has been changed in the past. For instance, we changed it for the victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Our legislation would open the American courts to lawsuits by Americans who have been harmed by this pandemic, to challenge the actions of Chinese leadership and the Chinese Communist Party, whether the criminal negligence that it increasingly appears is the result of this virus being or originating. The most likely hypothesis is that it originated in one of the labs in Wuhan, or in my opinion, the deliberately evil acts of the Chinese Communist Party in allowing Chinese nationals to continue to fly outside of China in December and January, well after they knew that this was transmissible from humans to humans and that it was highly, highly contagious and deadly.
Congressman, what from your vantage point in the House? Go ahead.
I would say I wasn't sure if you're going to finish that question. Or you're going to ask?
Oh no! I'm curious from your perspective as someone who is co-sponsoring from the House the approach to allow Americans to sue China. Why is this the best tactic that you think for us to begin?
Well, it's a tactic. It's a tool in our toolkit. This will not be the one thing that we do to hold China accountable. There should be many, many things. We're looking at ways to bring our supply chains home. We're looking at other ways to hold them accountable. There's a lot of policy that could have rebalanced our relationship with China that has been long standing that we just haven't had the political will to do. And maybe it's time to dust some of those things off. Take a look at Confucius Institutes. Take a look at what we can do to fight back against intellectual property theft. Why we like this particular bill is it gives Americans a chance to feel a sense of justice. There's so many people who have had some kind of damages leveled against them, and that is a result of China deliberately hiding this virus and allowing infected people to travel internationally, even while they knew not to let them travel domestically. That they've hid samples of the virus from us. They won't let us go investigate. They disappeared scientists who wanted to blow the whistle. There's clear and growing evidence of wrongdoing here. So it's not crazy to think that we might actually be able to present that evidence in our own court system. Furthermore, the Chinese have a lot of assets in the United States. Again, we don't expect Xi Jinping to just write us a big check, but we can go after assets here. So this isn't totally unreasonable. This may give Americans some sense of justice, but of course it's not the only avenue that we're going to take.
Yeah, I like that, and I think there are a lot of approaches, but this is a great place to start. And one thing that a lot of people in our audience have been curious about is because China holds so much of our debt, you can't just unilaterally cancel a debt unless you're inviting some sort of massive international conflict. But it does seem like there has got to be something that we can do in that regard, considering how much America is on China's debt list. So, Senator, let's talk about what we can do as Americans to start holding China accountable. But it's going to take a global effort. It can't just be the United States. You're probably going to need to get some allies involved to really hold their feet to the fire.
Well, Alex, your question is well taken, and it goes back to the point Dan made. Our legislation is simply one way that we will hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for unleashing this pandemic on the world. There are many other things we must do as well. For instance, I have legislation that would bring pharmaceutical manufacturing out of China and back to the United States by giving incentives to build new manufacturing plants here and also cutting off Chinese imports as well. We could also consider sanctions against Chinese officials, similar to what we do for those who violate human rights if they have covered up information that has led to a public health emergency. One thing I would encourage all of your listeners to do is boycott China. Unfortunately, it's not possible in every case. There are some goods that are made only in China, or that's the only place you can get them in the American market. But every time you have a chance, whether it's shopping for clothes, your kids' toys, or electronics, or anything else, if you have a chance to buy American or at least not buy Chinese, then I would encourage all your listeners to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good move as well. And let's talk a little bit about, Congressman, what you mentioned about some of the misinformation and some of the delayed information coming from China. Do we still there's still so many unanswered questions about what happened to those whistleblower doctors? Did it really start in the lab, or was it just from the wet market? And when did the virus even begin? Are they being at all forthcoming with the United States in terms of some of the details of the origin of the virus?
No, I mean, the number one priority of the Communist Party is to protect the Communist Party. This is why they hid it in the first place, and this is why they'll continue to lie about it to the greatest extent possible. On the day that we introduced this particular bill, that was also the same day the Chinese announced that they had to change their estimates of deaths in Wuhan by something like 50%. Claiming they didn't know that before. I think we can reasonably believe that they, of course, knew how many people died. They track every citizen in that country. Everybody has a social score. It's obvious that they were lying from the beginning. Again, they perpetuated falsehoods such as this virus couldn't be transmitted human-to-human contact. I mean, there's a growing mountain of evidence about these kind of lies. Senator Hawley and Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, I think, also have legislation for international investigation into Chinese intent and wrongdoing on this too. So there's a lot of different pieces of legislation that I think work together quite nicely.
Yeah, that's good. We've covered this one. Also, the Justice for Victims of COVID-19 Act is out there from Senator Hawley. That would be very interesting. It would strip China sovereign immunity for civil claims in U.S. courts and allow courts to freeze Chinese government assets. So that's out there as well. And it's a good that it seems like Republicans are very focused and unified on this. But in order to get this stuff through, you're going to need at least some level of Democrat support, maybe a tougher task on your side. Congressman, are you getting any bipartisanship in terms of this issue?
We have yet to see. I would like to think that there would be some political will. I mean, but you know the problem as well as I do. If there's any blame towards China, that takes away blame from Trump.
Yes.
And these people have become completely and utterly obsessed with this idea that Trump has blood on his hands and that he's totally responsible for a global pandemic. And again, even though I presented a pretty strong mountain of evidence and against that. And you have to ask them a simple question: like, if you're going to criticize somebody, then criticize at a specific decision point and with the facts that they had at the time, and tell us how it was so obvious that you would have made a different decision. Show us a fork in the road. They can't do that, right? But because they're not objective and they're not critical thinkers. And but I hope they'll be critical thinkers at least as it falls on the China issue and work with us on this.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that as time goes on that there will be at least some balance. But as Senator, we're up against the same problem as we always are. If you can make Trump the bad guy, that seems to be the singular focus, not just of the Democrats, but of the establishment media, who is just dedicating so much time to whether or not it's Trump's fault. We still have a massive geopolitical threat on our hands in China.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of our media, most of our Democrats, seem to be a little more focused on criticizing the president or opposing whatever he does rather than taking an honest look at the situation that our country faced going back months, as Dan said, or that we face now. The China travel restrictions are a good example. In January, the president was called xenophobic and racist and hysterical, and all of these mainstream media outlets said there is no way that you should do this, it won't work, and so forth, when now public health experts say that it bought us critical amounts of time. Or consider some of the restrictions in public places. I mean, look at what people, each other in big cities and not being afraid of the virus, or so on and so forth. Only whenever the president begins to make suggestions or make decisions do so many Democrats and so many members of the media begin to take the opposite tack. Again, no matter what the topic is or what the decision is.
Senator, are you optimistic that longer term, or at least medium term, that we're going to start showing some understanding that China could have done so much to at least give us a head start in preparing for this at a bare minimum, and they did not, because that is not how the Communist Party operates, and there will be at least some sort of a reckoning amongst the citizens of the United States? Or do you think that this is potentially something the media could just sweep under the rug and we'll just all move on as if this had nothing to do with China?
No, I think that's becoming clear today, Alex, and it will continue to become clear as more countries begin to revisit their relationship with China. Great Britain is already reconsidering its decision to allow Huawei, an arm of Chinese intelligence, to build out some of their 5G telecom networks. A lot of African countries are rethinking their relationship with China and the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think the central issue in this campaign is going to be who's right for this country as it relates to China. I mean, Joe Biden, as late as last year, was saying China is not a competitor of ours and has long celebrated the rise of China relative to the United States. So even if Democrats and the media want to sweep China's culpability for this pandemic under the rug, I don't think they're going to be able to.
Yeah, and if they were going to, they certainly don't have the right candidate as the standard bearer, I think, given the history we've long documented of the Biden family in China. Gentlemen, it's been such a pleasure to have both of you on. Congressman Dan Crenshaw, Senator Tom Cotton. If people want to show support for the bill, what should they do? Let's go to you, Congressman.
To show support for the bill? Well, yes. Tweet about it, put it on social media, tell your friends. I mean, and more importantly, I think, in order to sway public opinion and help people understand who's really at fault here, continue to share what we're putting out about how the Chinese have acted wrongly.
Yeah, I think that's the main takeaway, and that's something that I'm very thrilled that you guys are ahead of this, trying to put the focus on China, because we really need it, because the media is so determined to make this about Trump. It's not about Trump. It is about China, and it's good that we have young leaders like you gentlemen. Really appreciate the time on Breitbart News Daily.
Thank you so much,
Alex.
All right, we'll be right back.